And I've also listed here advanced predictive modeling. And, you know, it's interesting to me that people want to jump to this. They tell me about the predictive modeling. And because they're looking for the magic answer. There's so much to be gained before you ever get to advanced predictive modeling. But that has a value too. And what that really entails is looking at the database of an organization and looking at the historic data and identifying what are the factors that probably resulted in this outcome. Or if, and if you find that in the data, then you want to be wary of that claim and give it more attention. The reverse of that is if there was this factor, then you should be looking for these other factors that seem to be related, you know, that kind of thing. So it's all analytic, and it's predictive modeling based on mathematical formulas like regression analysis and all of that. Well, I'm not opposed to that. I think it's wonderful, and we provide that service, but I think there's so much to be gained before we ever get there by just looking at the data that's available to us now. And then, of course, comparing and scoring provider performance. Now, I've listed here quality provider performance indicators, not all of them, but some of them that we use, and we compare and score individual provider performance based on multiple indicators found in the data, like frequency, frequency of service, I should say, duration of services, return to work rates for a particular provider. Do they send people back to work? Will they send them back to modified duty? Do they ask about it? All of that stuff that you all know very well. What are the indemnity costs? Was there legal involvement? What we found is that very often claims that go sour because of the legal problems sometimes have a germinating effect from the doctor. They didn't like the way they were treated. Sometimes they didn't like the fact that the doctor said, "You're fine, go back to work." Well, you know, there's a different way to say that so that the employee is not shamed on psychological factors. We look at claim duration. We look at disability rating at the end, at the closure of the claim. Hey, that's outcome. And then claim reopening after closure. We also look at prescribing practices. And our clients actually send us updates of their data daily. We have one client, it's a TPA called Broadspire, and we get 4 files a day from them. And so the data that we have is as current as is logically possible. And so we're looking at prescribing practices because we want to be able to give our clients the heads up to intervene if this is the second or the third opioid subscription for 60 tablets or something of that nature. And so that because of the concern that people have now for claimants in their opioid use. What I'm saying in that regard is that we're looking at data, concurrent data, not waiting for a report at the end of the quarter. Concurrent data can be a work-in-process tool. It can be a fabulous tool for the case managers, for instance, if you find that out. Another example is when we're monitoring data continuously, and it's the 4th visit, and the doctor mentions in the diagnostic list that the patient's diabetic. Well, that's a pretty important factor that somebody needs to know, and so we send out alerts about that. But in any case, that's why we are looking at prescribing practices. We also look at an injury severity score, and what we've done, because it's always been a question in my mind, how do you know how bad the injury is? You know, if it's a fracture, you kind of know because they're either going to have pins and surgery and all that, or there's just going to be a cast, so you can sort of figure that out. But if it's low back strain, how bad is it? How disabled is the patient? How much pain are they in? All that kind of thing. How do you know? How do you know what the situation is? And so what we have done as an organization is that we've gone in and we've scored individual ICD-9s for the injury, the medical injury severity. Not the dollar severity, but the medical injury severity. And so we keep track of all the ICD-9s, and what's interesting is if you look at some of the claims in people's systems, there'll be a list as long as your arm of diagnoses. And so we print those for our clients with the date that that diagnosis was entered. And you'll see that in these complex claims, they just kind of evolve, and they sort of accrue diagnoses, and the whole picture begins to change, and you start to think, wait a minute, where do we start with this? So those kinds of things are indicators of complexity, and so these are the kinds of things that we monitor and tell people. We send alerts to claims adjusters, we send alerts to case managers, or whomever the client chooses. So what we do is we score individual providers on each of these indicators, and then we roll up their score into a composite score. And then I said the second most important thing is to link this information to operations. And what I find is that, in fact, somebody asked me this question. She said, we have all sorts of analytics, but we don't know what to do with them. Well, any analytics, any analysis, and by the way, let me just clarify something for you. Analytics is just a fancy way of saying analysis. Don't be put off by that. But if it's not handy to the people that are doing the work, what good is it? It has to be put into the hands of people that need the information when they need it and easily accessible so they can use it. So that's what I say about linking the analytics to operations. One way we do it is sending those alerts to case managers and claims adjusters. Another way we do it is by quick lookups and that sort of thing. But the tools, what we do then is provide the tools so that people can carve out their best-in-class networks. And the third thing that's really important if you're going to be doing this kind of work is to look at updating the data. And I mentioned that our clients send us updates on a daily basis. And I think this is important because the work units have never had access to current data. They can go in and look at individual claims, but they can't look at aggregated data that tells them trends and swings and what's going on. And so this is what needs to be available. So that's why our clients send us the data from those sources on a daily basis, and they update it, and then they have access to the interpretation of that data on a real-time basis. Not really real-time, sort of real-time, because it takes a while, as you know. But it's certainly more real-time than they've been having access to before. This is just one of the graphics that we provide, and I thought you might be interested in seeing. What we're looking at here is we're looking at provider performance, and we've we've asked to look at orthopedic surgeons. This is always by jurisdiction. We never cross state borders with these kinds of analysis because all the rules change. And what we do is compare a select orthopedic surgeon to the others in the state, and we can do it by diagnosis as well. So I didn't show that in this particular graphic, but the bar on the left is the organization's data and what their costs are, their mean costs for orthopedic surgeons in the state with PT, and then their mean costs without PT, and then the red is the select provider with PT, and the purple is without PT for that select provider. Now, all of these things, then we have drill down so we can look further into the data. This is just the first level, because if you're going to look at whether, if you're looking at cost only, it could be very, very frequent that the costs are going to be higher with PT, but you have to look at it in the context of outcome because you want to know what the outcome was to find out whether that was worth the extra cost. By and large, it is, and when we drill down to that. And I didn't show that part of it, but we're able to drill down into a claim summary that shows us the total costs and all the providers and their costs and the outcomes and of the claim. So I have to talk some more about data, because I mentioned to you that data is what I really like. What we've found is, and this is kind of, I'm sort of bringing this up because I'm starting to evangelize about data, because I want people to think about the quality of their data, because it really is going to matter in the future. I think Karen mentioned this, the fact that technology is going to be important. The quality of data is just critical, and so don't short people on the quality of your data. Encourage the people that enter your data to enter it completely and accurately, because what we're finding is that with manual entry or even OCR entry, we're getting all sorts of weird iterations for providers. And for instance, when they fill out the form, like the HCFA form, it's done differently every time. And then the company, the payer, will use OCR, and everything comes up different, so that we get duplicates in the data, and we get very weird duplicates. So you'll get, reversing last name and first name, you'll get commas, you'll get periods, you'll have abbreviations, and there'll be adding or the omitting of numbers or suite numbers, and using different abbreviations. I said suite, S-T-E, or suite, S-U-I-T-E, and suite, S-T-E period, suite, S-T-E no period, because computers, will consider each of those separate. And they do, and so what you'll find is that TPAs and insurers and other payers have duplicates of providers in their data. And how do you merge that? Well, another thing that we find is that licensing numbers such as NPI numbers and state medical license numbers are not used, but that differentiates the individual from the group. And I think we have to start differentiating individuals from groups. People are just not going to stand for it anymore that everybody's on the same tax ID. All 50 clinics, same tax ID, and that's the only differentiator. That's just not going to fly anymore. In fact, we work with one network administrator, and as they're putting together their new networks, their new outcome-based networks, by the way, where they do not deduct a discount. They pay the full amount because they're only using best practice providers. But what they're also telling the providers is that their data has to be accurate, and they have to provide it in a consistent manner. We ran into one doctor who has a group of clinics in Southern California. This is the worst one I've seen lately. In this client's database, there were 27 different iterations of that particular doctor in his group. This may not come as a surprise to you. He's a pain management doctor, and because they seem to be the most creative. But he was using multiple tax IDs. He was using multiple NPI numbers, which is the National Provider Identification Number for the CMS. He wasn't using any state medical license numbers. And so we, as a technology company, have to figure out how to merge these guys. Well, so we do that. You have to in the data itself, you have to merge it so you don't have 27 iterations of the same person, because you can't do good performance analysis using that kind of data. Another factor that's really critical is specialty. And so make sure that when you submit your bills, if you're a provider, or when you enter the data from bills, if you're a TPA or an employer, a self-administered employer, make sure the specialty is there. That can be very important, because Well, I just had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with a group in Southern California again. They're pain management doctors, and they said, you can't compare us on the basis of all of your comparison and your indicators. It's just not fair because we don't get claims until they're really bad and they're in bad trouble and the patient is really sick and they're usually addicted to their drugs, and you just can't do that. And I said, well, you know, if you would identify yourself as a pain management specialty, then you would be only compared against other pain management specialties. So, you know, that's just a very simple solution. But anyway, specialty is very important. And so I believe that, particularly the doctor that I was referring to earlier in Southern California, there's 27 iterations in this one database. I'm calling that data obfuscation, and I'm calling it deliberate fraud. Because why would an organization do that? I mean, it really is pretty obvious that they're trying to confuse the payer, trying to confuse them into paying more frequently or not realizing the kind of job that they're doing. So that's my sermon on data. And I just want to end with this thought that what gets us in trouble is not what we don't know, it's what we know for sure, that just ain't so. Obviously from Mark Twain. Any questions? Now I befuddled everybody. Yes? Oh, that's a good question. What's the turnaround time? Well, the way that we work is that when we contract with a client, we tell them what data we want and where the data usually lives, and we tell them that all they have to do is put it in a file and send it to us. Tell us what they sent, but they don't have to do the mapping or anything of that nature. Once we have that, it's usually 4 to 6 weeks before they can go online and start running, executing queries of their own data. Yeah. And I've been told by my IT department that I have to say 4 to 6 weeks. Sometimes it's less, but I'm not ever allowed to promise that.
Ms. Fahey, you don't have a question? I'm just kidding.
Thank you for asking.
So in terms of helping a TPA or adjuster make a decision about the provider that's being utilized,
Yes.
how are those TPAs, are they being dictated to, or are they just being dictated to that these are the best providers, or here are the top 5 providers in the geographical area that you should utilize?
Yeah, I didn't bring a graphic of that, but the way that they do it is that they go online to our system, and they put in, all they have to do is put in their specialty and the zip code region that they want. And I say zip code region because it can be a zip code, which is a fairly narrow region in many cases, or it could be just the first 2 digits of a zip code of a metropolitan area. So whatever, that makes sense. And then they get a list of best practice providers. In that list, we also list the number of visits or services that provider's been involved in. For a while, we decided that we couldn't really do an analysis if a provider has not provided more than 5 services or visits. And then what we found in the data was inadequate data. Well, that's more frustrating than anything. So now what we do is we just list the number of services or visits that they've had so that the user can determine whether they think it's valid enough. That seems odd, but that's what happens. You know, medicine is kind of a cottage industry. And so, you know, as you go across the country and you see, you know, there's Dr. So-and-so, and you know, how many visits is Dr. So-and-so going to have for a given organization? So that's the reason for that.